Picture a winter morning in Moscow. The sun barely rises, the sky is a bruised gray, and the air tastes like coal smoke. A woman in a padded coat stands in a line that bends around a corner and disappears into the dark. She isn't waiting for a luxury, she's waiting for something basic: butter, meat, soap. Her breath turns to mist. The line shuffles forward an inch at a time. Someone mutters that the delivery truck never came. Someone else swears it did come, but it went to a different store. A third voice says, "Don't worry, it will arrive," in the same tone people use when they are trying to calm themselves, not you. And then, like a knife sliding under a rib, someone asks the question nobody wants to say out loud: if we are a superpower, why do we live like this? Now cut in your mind to Western Siberia, a flat, frozen expanse where metal rigs bite into the ground and pump day and night. A flame burns above the wellhead like a signal fire. Oil runs into pipelines that stretch across a continent. On paper, this is wealth, this is strength, this is the resource that should make a state untouchable. And here is the shocking claim. The Soviet Union did not collapse because it lacked oil. It collapsed because oil rewired the system into a dependency it could not survive. The USSR didn't run out of oil. It ran out of the kind of money oil gave it. How can a superpower with oceans of oil end up rationing basics and begging for import? That is the mystery. And by the end of this story, you'll understand what most people never see. The Soviet Union didn't just have an economic problem, it had an economic trap. Oil revenue didn't merely fund the system. It trained the system to postpone hard fixes, to cover cracks with imports, and to build a lifestyle, political and economic, that only worked when the price of oil stayed high. Here's the promise of value. When we're done, you'll be able to explain the collapse in plain language, why rubles inside the USSR were not the same as real money abroad, why the Soviet state needed dollars like oxygen, how oil became the oxygen tank, and why the end looked sudden, even though the bankruptcy was building for years. In a moment, you'll see the turning point that looked like a temporary market swing, but quietly shut every escape route Moscow thought it had. Most people think the Soviet Union collapsed because communism doesn't work. That's a comforting myth because it sounds like a law of nature. Others say it collapsed because the United States forced it to spend itself into the ground in an arms race. Those stories are neat, but they aren't mechanism. The real story is messier and more unsettling. The Soviet system was already inefficient, already strained, already packed with perverse incentives. Oil didn't create those flaws. Oil covered them up, and by covering them up, it made them grow. To see why oil mattered, start with a constraint the Soviet leadership could never command away. Inside the USSR, the ruble was king. The state could print it, distribute it, and order everyone to accept it. Wages were paid in rubles, factories were funded in rubles, ministries argued over ruble allocations, and if they ran short, they could push the problem upward. But outside Soviet borders, the ruble was basically a local coupon. If you wanted to buy wheat from Canada, machine tools from Germany, chemicals from Western Europe, or precision electronics from Japan, foreigners didn't want your coupon. They wanted money they could use anywhere. Hard currency is just a plain phrase for money other people trust. Dollars, marks, francs, yen, whatever the world accepts without an argument. And in the global marketplace, trust is the real commodity. You can't order foreigners to trust your currency. You earn that trust by converting, by repaying, by delivering. If you don't have hard currency, you don't import. If you don't import, certain factories don't run. And if certain factories don't run, shortages spread like a stain through the rest of the economy. Now here's the part nobody talks about. A planned economy can promise anything internally. It can declare that next year there will be more meat, more shoes, more tractors. It can assign targets and punish failure. It can move rubles around like chess pieces. But hard currency is a different kind of reality. Hard currency is a wall. You can't bluff it. When you don't have it, ships don't unload, contracts don't renew, spare parts don't arrive. The planned economy learns in the harshest way that it can't plan the outside world. That lesson arrived through small humiliation. A harvest comes in weak, cities are sensitive, and food is political. Suddenly you need grain from abroad. Officials tell themselves it's temporary, Next year will be better. The plan will catch up. But the bill arrives in foreign money, and the same question returns like a recurring nightmare. Where do we get the dollars? In the late 1960 seconds and into the 1970 seconds, Siberia began answering that question. Huge oil fields came online, pipelines stretched across a continent, crews worked in brutal cold to keep production rising, and the world price of oil rose sharply across the decade. For Soviet planners, it felt like the world had quietly handed them a cheat code. Pump oil, sell it for hard currency, buy what the plan can't provide. Oil became the bridge between a closed internal system and an external market it could not control. Here's mini story number 1, because it shows how quickly a lifeline becomes a... Picture a meeting in Moscow in the late 1972. The mood is tense, grain deliveries are behind. A food shortage in a capital city is not an inconvenience. It is a political threat. The agriculture officials list causes: weather, machinery, fertilizers, logistics. The planners talk about targets. Then the conversation turns practical, almost desperate. Someone says, quietly, that you can't command a harvest into existence next week. Someone else asks what it would cost to import grain. The room falls into that heavy silence where everyone knows the answer, but nobody wants to say it. It costs hard currency. And then someone points to the one sector that can bring hard currency in quickly: oil. The meeting ends not with a solution, but with a habit. Whenever the plan fails, pump more. That lever worked often enough that it became policy without being announced. Oil exports became the hard currency lifeline. When food was short, oil paid for grain. When factories needed advanced equipment, oil paid for import. When the public grew restless, oil paid for consumer goods that made daily life feel less bleak. When the state wanted to maintain commitments abroad, oil paid the bill. Oil became the silent translator between the planned economy and the real world. But here's the catch. When a lifeline saves you repeatedly, you build your life around it. You stop learning how to swim. You stop redesigning the boat. You stop asking why you keep falling into the water in the first place. Think of the Soviet economy like it had 2 wallets. One wallet was rubles, usable inside the Soviet system because the state said so. The other wallet was hard currency, usable abroad because foreigners trusted it. The state could stuff the ruble wallet endlessly. It could not stuff the hard currency wallet endlessly. That wallet depended on exports the world would actually pay for. And as the decades passed, that wallet became more and more dependent on one export in particular: oil and other raw materials tied to the same global price cycle. One detail makes the 2-wallet problem even sharper. The Soviet ruble was not freely convertible. Ordinary citizens couldn't simply walk into a bank, exchange rubles for dollars, and go shopping abroad. Most enterprises couldn't either. Foreign trade was tightly controlled, and hard currency was handled through specialized state organizations. That meant hard currency wasn't just scarce, it was centralized. It was political. If a ministry wanted to import anything, it didn't just need money. It needed permission from the center to access money, the center guarded like a strategic resource. Think about what that does to behavior. If hard currency is centralized, every ministry becomes a lobby. Every factory manager becomes a petitioner. Every region learns to exaggerate needs and hide waste because the allocation process rewards urgency, not efficiency. And the center, flooded with requests it cannot verify, begins allocating hard currency like a commander allocating ammunition to whoever seems most essential, most powerful, or most dangerous to ignore. Oil revenue in that world was not just income. It was a pressure release that reduced the fights. When the pressure release is open, the system feels calmer. The allocation meetings are less brutal. The center can say yes more often. But when oil revenue falls, the fights return. Suddenly, every hard currency allocation becomes a political decision. Whose factory slows, whose region suffers, whose ministry loses prestige. There's another uncomfortable layer. Because hard currency was treated as special, it created a visible hierarchy. Some institutions had better access to imported goods and better supply lines. Some neighborhoods had better stores. Some people had ways to get foreign goods, while others stared at empty shelves. That inequality wasn't new, but scarcity makes inequality louder. When the system can't provide, people stop judging it by ideology and start judging it by fairness. Oil filled that hard currency wallet, and for a while, it felt like abundance. Abundance does something dangerous to human minds. It turns luck into expectation. It turns a boom into a baseline. It makes leaders plan as if the good years are guaranteed. It makes ministries request imports like entitlements. It makes citizens feel slightly less deprived, and that raises expectations. Once expectations rise, cutting back becomes politically expensive. Most people think the Soviet collapse was caused by a lack of industry. But the real story is not that the USSR failed to build factories. It built huge factories. The deeper problem was that much of that output did not translate into hard currency. The world did not line up to buy Soviet consumer electronics or cars at premium prices. Soviet industry could produce a lot, but it often produced the wrong thing at the wrong quality under incentives that rewarded quantity over usefulness. So the hard currency engine didn't come from exporting finished goods people wanted. It came from exporting raw materials people. Now we build the oil machine. And it's not just drilling. It's a circuit. Oil earns hard currency. Hard currency buys import. Imports patch domestic failure. Patching domestic failure reduces reform pressure. Reduced reform pressure deepens inefficiency. Deepened inefficiency increases reliance on imports. The circuit is self-reinforcing. When oil is expensive, it looks like stability. When oil is cheap, it looks like collapse. Start with grain. Soviet agriculture was a chronic struggle. Weather mattered, but incentives mattered more. When rewards are disconnected from results, effort becomes symbolic. Machinery breaks and isn't replaced quickly. Inputs arrive late. Logistics clog. Harvests swing. When harvests were short, the state imported grain. Oil made that possible. Each import shipment reduced the immediate political danger, which also reduced the urgency to rebuild the agricultural system from the ground up. The system learned that instead of fixing agriculture, it could buy agriculture. Technology imports were another pressure valve. Modern industry needs precision, specialized tools, and constant upgrading. The USSR could build machines, but it lagged in many high-precision sectors. It imported equipment to close gaps. But imported equipment doesn't live alone. It needs spare parts. It needs maintenance. It needs compatible inputs. So every technology import quietly created a future hard currency obligation. Oil revenue made those obligations feel manageable, so they grew. Consumer imports mattered even more politically. In a system that promised stability, shortages are not just annoying, they are humiliating. When citizens stand in line for basic goods, they aren't merely inconvenienced. They're being taught a lesson about the system's limits. Leaders understood that, so they used imports to cover the most visible failures. A shipment of foreign meat or shoes wasn't just commerce. It was political anesthesia. It quieted anger. It bought time. But anesthesia has a cost. It numbs warning signals. The pain that would force a system to change gets postponed, and postponed pain comes back as damage. Now we reach the incentive core, because this is where oil becomes a quiet bankruptcy machine. In a planned economy, factories and ministries are judged by targets. Produce a certain number of tractors, deliver a certain tonnage of steel, fulfill a quota by a deadline. Those targets become survival. Managers learn to negotiate them downward, hoard inputs, and protect themselves. If you're rewarded for quantity, you maximize count, not use. If you're rewarded for weight, you produce heavy junk. If you're punished for admitting shortages, you hide shortages, and hidden shortages spread. Most people think Soviet shortages were simply laziness or incompetence, but the real story is incentives and accounting. The plan could report success while citizens experienced failure. Paper output could rise while useful goods fell. The system became brilliant at producing numbers and strangely bad at producing satisfaction. Here's a vivid example of paper success. If a factory is told to produce a certain number of nails, it might produce tiny nails because they're easier to count. If it's told to meet a weight target, it might produce huge nails because weight is easier than usefulness. It meets the plan reports victory. The construction site still lacks the right nails. The point isn't the nails. The point is that when rewards are tied to the wrong measurement, the system optimizes for the measurement, not the mission. And here is where oil does its quiet damage. In many systems, failure forces adjustment because failure costs money. In the Soviet system, internal failure often didn't cost money the same way because the state could cover losses with rubles. If a factory is inefficient, it doesn't go bankrupt. It gets another allocation. If a ministry misses a target, it negotiates, shifts numbers, blames suppliers. There is no hard stop inside the ruble world. Economists call this soft budget constraints, but you can feel it without jargon. The system doesn't let bad plans die, so bad plans reproduce. The outside world could not be papered over. Foreign suppliers demanded hard currency. Foreign lenders demanded repayment. The state could not print dollars. So oil revenue became the bridge over the external wall. And because that bridge existed, the internal system learned it could keep operating without fixing it. Oil didn't just buy wheat, it bought denial. Mini story number 2.5. A plant director receives a set of imported machine tools, shiny and precise, the kind that can finally make parts within tight tolerances. For a month, the factory looks like the future. Then, a small component fails. The replacement part is not made locally. The service manual is foreign. The supplier wants hard currency. The director sends requests upward. The ministry delays. The hard currency budget is tight. The machine sits idle, a monument to the difference between having equipment and being able to keep equipment alive. This is how a hard currency shortage turns into an industrial slowdown, even when the country has plenty of steel and plenty of workers. In modern industry, the bottleneck is often not the big materials. It's the specialized parts, the precision inputs, the maintenance chain. Oil revenue had been paying for those chains. When oil revenue shrank, those chains snapped, and the breakpoints were often invisible until production fell off a cliff. Now, here's a rehook you should keep in your head. The Soviet economy did not collapse because it stopped producing things. It collapsed because it stopped being able to coordinate the production of useful things. Coordination requires information and inputs. Information degraded because bad news was punished. Inputs degraded because imports shrank. Oil decline hit both at once. Here's the twist that reframes the whole story. It wasn't that Soviet leaders were too stupid to reform. Oil made non-reform rational. Reform is painful. It threatens interest. It risks short-term disruption. It admits the old model has failed. If you can stabilize the system by exporting more oil, the political cost of reform feels higher than the cost of delay. So the system chooses delay again and again. And every delay is a bet on oil staying high. Now we step into the hard currency ledger, where the thriller becomes arithmetic. Imagine the Soviet state as having two budgets. One budget is internal, in rubles. It funds wages, internal production, and planned allocation. It can be stretched by printing money or shifting plan number. The other budget is external, in hard currency. This budget pays for imports, services, foreign loans, and keeps the import machine alive. It is smaller and unforgiving. When it breaks, the system loses access to the outside goods it has quietly come to rely on. Mini story number 2. Picture a planner in the early 1982. On his desk are thick reports full of impressive numbers. Fulfillment rates, output percentages, tons, units. He can argue with ministries about ruble allocations all day. Then he opens a thin folder, the hard currency account. This folder lists what must be paid abroad for grain contracts, equipment orders, and debts. There's no way to redefine those numbers into success. He can't reclassify a missed payment as a triumph. He can't turn a foreign invoice into a patriotic speech. Hard currency is where the system meets reality. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, that folder looked better than before because oil prices were high and exports were strong. The state increased imports, it expanded commitments, it raised expectations. It used oil revenue not only to fix problems, but to avoid them. It began, quietly, to budget as if oil income was permanent. Not because leaders were foolish, but because repeated rescue creates faith in rescue. This is the psychological shift that matters. High oil revenue doesn't just add money, it raises the system's minimum survival level. The state becomes accustomed to importing grain, importing equipment, importing consumer goods to patch gaps. Citizens become accustomed to those patches too. Once people adapt to a higher level of provision, taking it away feels like collapse, even if it's just returning to an older reality. Then, the world changed. In the mid-1980s, global oil prices fell sharply and stayed lower for a prolonged period. The reasons were global. Supply shifts, demand shifts, decisions by major producers, and a market that moved regardless of Soviet wishes. For the Soviet Union, the effect was simple. Each barrel earned fewer hard currency. For a country whose external wallet depended on that stream, this was a pay cut and the only paycheck that mattered. And here's why an oil price fall is different from almost any other shock for a state like this. Oil income arrives in hard currency and arrives quickly, but it can vanish quickly too, because the price is set outside your borders. You can't order it higher. You can't plan it higher. If you've built your import system, your food safety net, and your industrial maintenance on that stream, then volatility turns planning into gambling. A market economy can respond to a shock by letting prices adjust and letting some firms fail so others can replace them. The Soviet system responded by trying to hold everything in place while the hard currency floor was disappearing underneath. At first, it did not look fatal, and that is why it was fatal. There is always a lag. Import contracts don't end overnight. Ships still arrive. Warehouses still have inventory. The state has reserves. It can borrow. The leadership tells itself the price drop is temporary. It keeps spending to avoid panic. That is the first deception. The crisis starts quietly because buffers exist. Then the buffers drain and quiet bankruptcy begins. Not with a dramatic default, but with a sequence of increasingly desperate measures that eat the future to pay the present. The state sells reserves to raise hard currency. It borrows from foreign banks because borrowing is time. It delays payments where it can. It squeezes allies for better terms. It cuts imports in categories that won't cause immediate riots. Each move keeps the machine running. Each move also reduces resilience. Every emergency measure is a hidden tax on the future. As hard currency tightens, the state protects food imports as long as possible because hunger is political dynamite. But protecting food means cutting elsewhere. Consumer goods that keep morale stable, industrial equipment that keeps factories productive, spare parts that keep transport functioning, specialized inputs that keep chemicals and metallurgy running. The system begins to break in ways that don't look dramatic at first. A shortage of bearings, a lack of tires, delayed catalysts, a missing component that stops an entire production line. Here's the part nobody talks about. Scarcity in a punishment-based system produces lying. Not only propaganda, but operational lies. A manager who reports failure risks punishment. A manager who reports success keeps access to resources. So as resources shrink, information quality collapses. The center becomes blind at the worst possible moment, and a planned economy runs on information. When information degrades, planning becomes guesswork. Guesswork at national scale becomes chaos. Now make the cascade vivid. A factory that makes appliances needs an imported component that has been used for years. Without it, production slows. The manager knows the quota is non-negotiable, so he ships incomplete products to meet the plan on paper. Stores receive goods that break. Citizens complain. Another factory depends on those appliances as part of a delivery chain. It can't fulfill its own target. Transport ministries move goods with vehicles that are wearing out. Spare parts are scarce. Logistics slow. A delay in one place becomes a shortage in another. The plan becomes brittle, like glass. And while this cascade spreads, the ruble world keeps pretending it is stable. Wages still get paid. The state can print rubles to cover commitments, but printing rubles doesn't create goods. It creates money chasing fewer goods, which creates hidden inflation. In a controlled price system, inflation doesn't always show up as rising prices. It shows up as empty shelves, longer lines, and black market. The state can freeze prices on paper, but it can't freeze reality in kitchen. Most people think the Soviet collapse was sudden, but the real story is a slow squeeze followed by cascading failure. The collapse you can see was the final stage. The collapse you can't see was the hard currency oxygen draining year after year until the system had no margin left. Now, how do we define bankruptcy for a state? It isn't a court filing, it's a condition. It's when a government cannot reliably pay for essential imports and cannot meet external obligations without extraordinary measures that exhaust the future. The USSR reached that condition. It still had factories and soldiers and citizens, but it could not keep paying for the external goods and credit that had become essential to internal stability. Once a state becomes externally constrained, it begins to trade away the future. It postpones maintenance. It cuts investment. It sacrifices modernization for emergency shifts. It turns long-term projects into short-term bandages. It becomes a system that is alive but not healing. And each month that passes, the choices narrow. Now we go inside the decision room because the most frightening part is that leaders saw the danger and still couldn't escape. Mini story number 3, a Kremlin meeting in the late 1980 seconds. The leader looks calm on television, but behind closed doors, The mood is ice. A finance official lays out the hard currency situation. Import bills are high. Export earnings are down. Credit is tightening. A planner insists food must be protected at all costs because starving cities are unstable. An industry minister warns that cutting industrial imports will halt factories, worsen shortages, and reduce domestic output, making the problem even worse. A security official says unrest is rising and the state's authority is weakening. Someone suggests reforms. Someone else warns that reforms will disrupt supply chains and ignite inflation. The room is full of people arguing over which kind of fire is safer to stand in. To buy time, the state turns to borrowing, and this is where quiet bankruptcy tightens. Borrowing buys time, but time comes with interest, and interest is a form of gravity. Mini story number 4. A foreign trade official negotiating credit. In earlier years, meetings with Western bankers had an almost routine quality. The USSR was a superpower. It would pay, oil income looked solid. But now the tone changes. The questions get sharper. The terms get tougher. Lenders want reassurances, reforms, transparency. The Soviet official knows transparency is dangerous because it reveals weakness and invites political attacks at home. He also knows that without the loan, imports will shrink, and shrinking imports will produce shortages that fuel the very instability everyone feels. He sits in a room where other people's doubts are being priced into his country's future. That is what a hard currency crisis feels like. You can't argue your way out of it. You can only pay your way out of it. Here's the bigger rehook that flips the story again. It wasn't oil alone. It was oil plus debt, plus import dependence, plus brittle incentive. Oil acted like a silent amplifier. It funded the system during the boom and made it comfortable carrying heavy burdens. Then, when prices fell, those burdens remained while the income shrank. Chronic weakness became acute failure. Yes, the Soviet military burden was heavy. Yes, Afghanistan was costly. Yes, stagnation and bureaucracy were real. But oil is the amplifier because it determined how much hard currency the USSR had to carry all of those burdens while still importing food and technology. The arms burden didn't have to rise to become unbearable. The income stream just had to shrink beneath it. Most people think the Soviet Union fell because it was militarily defeated in a budget war. But the real story is that it lost financial flexibility. Even if military spending had stayed constant, the external revenue shock made the system suddenly unaffordable in hard currency terms. The USSR could print rubles, it could not print dollars, and the world demanded dollars. Most people think the Soviet economy was isolated, so global oil prices shouldn't have mattered. But the real story is that isolation was never absolute. The USSR imported grain, technology, and specialized goods. It relied on external systems to buy what it could not make or could not make well. The planned economy could be closed in ideology while still open in necessity. Oil prices mattered because they determined how much the USSR could buy, and what it could buy determined how stable daily life would feel. Now watch what scarcity does inside a bureaucracy. During the boom, Moscow could fund many priorities at once: military programs, consumer imports, subsidies to allies, investment projects, and the bureaucracy itself. It was never efficient, but it was stable. Abundance hides conflict. Scarcity reveals it. When hard currency shrank, ministries fought for the remaining dollars. Which projects get parts? Which industries get imported equipment? Which cities get better supplies? Those decisions stop being about economics and become about power. Scarcity also changes elite privilege in a way the public can. The Soviet system always had special supply channels, better stores, better distributions, better guarantees for key institutions. When goods became scarcer, those channels mattered more. Ordinary citizens saw unfairness more clearly because the line outside the store grew longer while some people never stood in it. You don't need political theory to understand that. You need eyes. And once people believe the system is unfair, they stop treating it as legitimate. Now return to the oil sector, because the Soviet response to falling prices created its own trap. When prices fall, the obvious move is to pump more to earn the same hard currency. But in oil, volume is constrained by geology and infrastructure. Pushing fields harder can damage long-term output and raise future costs. It's like trying to keep your income stable after a pay cut by working until your body breaks. Mini story number 5. An oil manager in Siberia receives an order to raise output. The center needs exports. He looks at the rigs. They're aging. Parts are scarce. Workers are stretched. Winter is brutal. He knows he can squeeze more production for a while by pushing wells harder and delaying maintenance. He also knows this risks accelerating decline and increasing future costs. But the system rewards him for meeting targets now, not for preserving reservoirs later. So he pushes. Output rises briefly. The reports look good. The center breathes a little easier. But the field is being drained in a way that steals tomorrow to pay today. Here's the trap inside that mini story. Every short-term fix requires a bigger fix later. Every postponement increases the cost of adjustment. Oil made postponement easy. Lower prices made the bill arrive. As the crisis deepened, Moscow's menu was brutal. Cutting imports meant choosing which pillar of stability to damage first: food, technology, or consumer goods. Borrowing meant paying for today by tightening tomorrow. Devaluing or creating a dual exchange system meant admitting the ruble's fiction and risking inflation and panic. Deep reform meant disrupting the old coordination before a new one existed. Repression meant enforcing suffering without creating hard currency. Decentralization meant giving up control and accelerating breakup. Every option had a political cost, and most options had an economic lag, which meant leaders were always paying for yesterday while being punished for tomorrow. Most people think reforms caused the collapse, but the real story is that reforms happened because the old model had lost its financial oxygen. Reform didn't create the hard currency crisis. The hard currency crisis forced reform into a brittle system, and brittle systems react badly even to necessary change, because change is stress and brittle things shatter under stress. Look beyond the Soviet border. The USSR maintained influence in allied states, partly through economic arrangement, favorable trade, subsidized energy, predictable support. Those arrangements were expensive. During high oil income years, they were manageable. When hard currency shrank, Moscow tightened terms and reduced subsidies. That signaled weakness. Allies noticed, rivals noticed, and when the Soviet center could not pay to keep influence, it lost influence faster than it expected. Most people think the Soviet Empire collapsed because Moscow suddenly became kind, but the real story is that influence is financed. When financing dries up, empire loosens. Oil decline turned generosity into a luxury the USSR could no longer afford. Now we reach the stage where the crisis becomes unstoppable, and the reason is structural. A market economy has decentralized adaptation. Prices change, businesses fail, new businesses form, resources shift. It's painful, but the system has a built-in way to adjust. The Soviet system required central decisions. Prices were commands, not signals. Enterprises were protected because failure was politically unacceptable. Resources moved through bureaucracy. When the shock hit, the system had fewer automatic ways to adapt, and the center had worse information because scarcity encouraged lies. This is why the hard currency constraint is deadly. The USSR could print rubles to keep enterprises alive, but printing rubles without goods creates inflation and shortages. It could order enterprises to keep producing, but producing without inputs creates waste and junk. It could command distribution, but distribution without supply creates queues and corruption. The hard currency shortage reduced imports. Reduced imports, reduced production capacity. Reduced production, reduced goods. Fewer goods made rubles less meaningful. And when rubles lose meaning, the state's basic control mechanism weakened. Now feel the human side again. A family plans meals around rumors. Today, there might be sugar. Tomorrow, maybe chicken. Someone knows a clerk. Someone knows a driver. Relationships become currency. Time becomes a cost. People miss work to stand in line. Productivity drops because survival consumes attention. The state shames hoarders, but people hoard because tomorrow is uncertain. The state blames speculators, but speculation grows because official channels fail. People begin to live in a parallel economy of favors, bartering, and quiet theft because the official economy can't be relied on. And each empty shelf is an argument against the system. Not an argument in philosophy, an argument in stomachs. Most people think corruption caused the collapse. Corruption was real, and it grew as scarcity grew, because scarcity makes informal networks valuable. But corruption is often a symptom, not the first cause. When official channels can't deliver, people create unofficial channels. When official prices lie, black markets tell the truth. Corruption became the grease holding daily life together, which is exactly why it also undermined the state. it proved the plan couldn't be trusted. Most people think one leader's personality explains the end. Leadership mattered, but the structural squeeze would have punished any leader. Oil revenue had raised the system's survival floor. A prolonged fall in oil income lowered the ceiling of what the state could do. Between a rising floor and a falling ceiling, there isn't much room to maneuver. That is why the last years feel like panic. The room itself was shrinking. Now, add the political layer. As shortages grow, the center loses the ability to buy loyalty. Regional leaders begin asserting control. Republics demand more autonomy. If you're a local leader, you have a simple incentive. If Moscow can't provide, you must provide yourself, or you will be blamed. Once you begin providing yourself, you begin acting independently. Independence starts as logistics, then it becomes politics, then it becomes history. Most people think the Soviet Union fell because people stopped believing. Belief matters, but belief often follows material reality. When the state can't provide basic goods, belief breaks. When belief breaks, compliance breaks. When compliance breaks, production and distribution break further. Belief is not the first domino, but it is one of the biggest, and the hard currency squeeze pushed it over. Now add one more subtle mechanism: energy pricing and waste. Inside the USSR, energy was often cheap. That kept households calm and helped heavy industry. But cheap energy encourages waste. Industries become energy hungry, buildings leak heat, machines run inefficiently. This doesn't look like a crisis when export revenue is high. When export revenue declines, domestic waste becomes an opportunity cost. Every barrel burned inefficiently at home is a barrel not sold for hard currency. The system faces a cruel trade-off. Keep energy cheap and wasteful domestically to maintain calm, or tighten domestic energy and risk unrest. Neither option creates new dollars quickly. In the late stage, even the methods the USSR used to compensate for low oil income had limits. Selling more raw materials takes time and investment. Expanding gas exports or other commodity deals requires infrastructure, contracts, and stable credit. Arms exports can bring hard currency, but they also come with political trade-offs and aren't guaranteed. The Soviet leadership kept searching for substitutes, but substitutes are slower than crises. Oil had become the fastest lever, and the lever was no longer strong enough. That's why the collapse feels like a sudden fall off a ridge. When a system depends on a volatile income stream, it can look stable for years and then look fragile overnight. The stability is real, but it's conditional. When the condition disappears, the system doesn't gradually adjust. It suddenly discovers it has been living on borrowed time. Here's the bigger rehook that ties it all together. The Soviet Union wasn't undone by a single failure. It was undone by a structure that required a steady external oxygen supply to compensate for internal dysfunction. Oil was that oxygen. Oil kept the system alive long enough for internal disease to worsen. When the oxygen thinned, the disease didn't merely return. It attacked everything at once: budgets, imports, production, legitimacy, unity. Now we walk into the endgame. By the late 1982nd and into the early 1992nd, the Soviet state faced a choice between austerity and chaos. But austerity in a planned economy doesn't look like tightening your belt gently. It looks like cutting shipments, shutting factories, and risking political breakdown. The state tried to avoid a clean austerity shock, so it paid for the present by damaging the future, printing money, delaying obligations, improvising allocations, forcing enterprises to operate without the inputs that made production meaningful. More rubles chased fewer goods. The distance between paper life and real life widened. The state tried to preserve control, but control requires credibility. When people don't believe you can deliver, they stop obeying. When enterprises don't believe inputs will arrive, they hoard and barter. When regions don't believe the center will help, they keep resources for themselves. The plan, which required centralized coordination, becomes a dead letter. Informal markets expand. Corruption becomes a survival strategy. The official economy becomes a shell. At that point, even if oil prices had rebounded, recovery would have required time, trust, and coherent coordination. Those were the very things the crisis destroyed. That is the final cruelty of the lag. The shock begins as a financial squeeze, but it ends as a systemic breakdown. The state doesn't just lose money, it loses the ability to coordinate. Now return to that winter morning in Moscow. The woman in line is still waiting. Behind her, someone whispers that a truck was diverted. Someone blames corruption. Someone blames the leader. Someone says the system is rotten. They aren't debating ideology in academic terms. They are measuring legitimacy in kilograms of. And now remember the rigs in Siberia, still pumping, still flaring, still feeding pipeline. A country with oil is not automatically wealthy. Wealth is not simply having a resource. Wealth is having an economic system that can turn that resource into stable productivity, resilient supply chains, and credibility at home and abroad. When global prices shifted, the USSR discovered that power without solvency is a costume. The army still existed, the slogans still hung on walls, the party still met in grand halls. But somewhere in a ledger that didn't care about ideology, the numbers stopped working. Ships didn't unload, factories didn't restart, shelves didn't refill. The system that could command people could not command dollars. That is how oil quietly bankrupted the USSR. Not because oil is evil, not because one decision doomed everything, but because oil revenue created a hidden dependency that reshaped choices. It let leaders postpone reform. It let ministries keep playing games with paper success. It let the state import solutions instead of building them. It taught the leadership to budget for a boom as if it were normal life. And when the boom ended, every weakness oil had hidden became a crisis. Oil could no longer pay to hide. So the final question is not just what happened to them. The final question is what happens to any system that confuses a temporary windfall for permanent strength. The Soviet Union's last years were not the story of a mighty fortress taken by storm. They were the story of an oxygen tank running low while the people inside argued about the paint on the walls. And the last haunting thought is that if you can't tell whether your strength comes from productivity or from a single volatile stream of cash, you don't really know how strong you are at all.